Hello, family. It's your sister Jocelyn here, and welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting you with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing trainings across the country. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, today I'm excited to welcome to the show a woman of God who I had the opportunity to experience her work last year in the form of a restorative practice circle. She did some great work with the art of hosting, and this was the first time I was exposed to it. And so she is here today, Chantilly Mers. For almost 15 years, Chantilly has been leading, organizing, and facilitating healing-centered church and community and indigenous communities. She is a circle keeper. She is passionate about working with the community to help people to transform and to heal. And so I'm so glad to welcome her to the show today. Reverend Chantilly, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Reverend Jocelyn.
Yeah. I was so blessed by my experience with you when we got together. You created a beautiful experience where you were hosting individuals to help them with their healing practice in community. And we're going to get into that in just a moment. But before we do, I would love for you just to share more about your journey, even before getting into this community work. Kind of what made Chantilly.
So, I grew up in a very, I would say, religious household. My my stepdad, was a Jehovah's Witness, and my mom was a Protestant Christian. And so, I would say, like growing up, a lot of my faith formation was kind of like debates about religion. And it was kind of fear-inducing also, where it was like, if you don't have the truth, you don't have the way. Um, like we're in danger. It was almost like things, it's scary growing up like this, where I go to congregation in the morning and then I go to praise church at night. Um, so by the time I was about 13, my mom said, we can't keep you all our kids going to two churches and two places, and she just said, we're going to stop, and at some point you're going to just choose your path. And so I was about 16, and this is where I say that this is the moment that I had a encounter. I was 16 and I walked into this Baptist church, and I walked in with my best friend, who as a teenager was going through some really tough stuff in his family, and I was going through some tough things in my family with separation and divorce. And we both walked into this church, and I still remember the minister looking at me saying, there's nothing that you're feeling today that Jesus himself hasn't felt. Do you feel alone? Do you feel abandoned? Do you feel like nobody understands you? And I was about 16. I still remember being in the back of that pew and looking at that man saying, I do think that Jesus can empathize with me. Like somehow Jesus knows me. Um, so I say I walked up to the altar, and I need to tell people my conversion moment, because I walked up to the altar not because I was afraid of where I was going to go when I died. I walked to the altar because I felt that there was a God that embraced me as I was, and said that there was like someone who could empathize, who knew what I was going through, and would walk me towards more healing, more wholeness, right? So the path of faith has always been this journey of more wholeness, more healing. And it sort of made a turn away from fear, right? Where am I going to go when I die? I'd say like that's kind of how what brought me into sort of this journey.
That's a beautiful story. That's beautiful, and I appreciate how you speak of it being a journey from the beginning of wanting healing, wanting wholeness, wanting to know more. And I see your work now. And can you talk a little bit more about the evolution in terms of what made you not only focus on your healing, but communal healing is a big part of what you do. So kind of what led you down this path?
So I ended up studying religion in undergrad, studying New Testament actually. At the time, it was really about like, what is then the truth, though? I've been taught to be afraid of God. I've been taught that there's a God of wrath that's waiting and having judgment towards me. But the encounter I had that's not the God I experienced. And so I decided to study it. And it was very intellectual for me at the time, until I went to grad school and I went to seminary and I started encountering the works of like liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez from South America, Black liberation theology from James Cone, and it's like this movement of the work of God being not just my own individual place where I go, right, but salvation being connected to not only liberation, but like social and communal liberation. And that's what sort of transformed it for me. And at the time, I was in New York City, and it was a really pivotal time when I was studying because Obama just got elected. And then soon after, like 2010, I want to say it was the Occupy movement happened, and then Black Lives Matter happened, all while I was serving a community in Harlem. And it was all of these political, social forces that, when your faith comes to sort of at these crossroads. And I started practicing and doing more work with activists and organizers. So I also did activists and organizing with the Poor People's Campaign and Black Lives Matter. And I started seeing just one that I didn't know how to be a person. Honestly, I didn't know how to be a person of faith in activist spaces. I just sort of, even though I came in as a minister, but I started realizing that they were just the tension I felt in my body in these spaces was that we were not holding our trauma well. I mean, meaning we were angry and upset. Eric Garner got murdered in New York City during the time that I was also doing organizing work. And it was like we were angry and we were sad and we were grieving. And I started like saying, I don't think these are the spaces that we're going to know how to heal. We're organizing and getting on the streets, but we didn't know how we were going to hold these spaces for healing until I walked into Riverside Church. You know, Riverside Church in New York City, it's like a historic church. Yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
historic church, Martin Luther King. Towards the end of the Vietnam War, he actually preached a really pivotal sermon in Riverside Church where he talked about the three axes of evil. So we're at Riverside Church, and this is the first time I walked into an art of hosting training. And it was made up of folks that I've seen organizing on the streets, ministers, pastors, leaders, community leaders, and they gathered because of Occupy. And this is the first time I encountered circle work and powerful conversations that were really about how do we harness our community and collective power to change, right? It was really about social change, but I felt the movement of the spirit there. And I had never, I was like, wait, this is not church. I mean, I know I'm in a church, but why am I feeling this? I'm feeling the move of the spirit. And and so my elder who brought me to that, he was the one who introduced me to Circle, and he would do retreats. His name is Rich Rivera. I always call upon my elders every time I talk about this story because Rich Rivera, I walked away and I said, "Do you feel the spirit?" And he goes, "Oh, the spirit is moving." He's like, "It's moving between us." And he's like, "It's the collective wisdom that happens when the spirit shows up." He's like, "The same way it showed up in Pentecost." He was like, "That's the collective spirit. It's when people have a new understanding and they actually start shifting, right, as a collective." And that's when I knew I was literally trained to do church. But that's kind of my like sort of I started shifting and I was like, it's church is about the gathering of people, right? It's two or more.
Yes, yes, I love that. I think that sometimes we put church in a box as to what it should look like, and you're like, "When the people are gathered, we having church."
And when we're gathered with this is the and the spirit's movement to me because of just the I was doing theology in school, but it wasn't until I started doing activism and organizing and community building did it sort of make sense to me on the ground. You know what I mean? Like it moved from the intellectual to like this is how it really matters in people's lives. So this movement of the spirit is moving, and and even in the scriptures it says like we do not actually know always where the spirit is going, where it blows, where she goes, where he, it's like we're just moving with the spirit, but it's still towards, for me, the alignment is always, it's still towards what Jesus called the kingdom of God. I interpret the kingdom of God, I used to interpret it as like this other place where I'd go, like heaven, right? And also, but the way Jesus talked about the kingdom of God was that where people had everything they needed, where people were fed. Like, and he would talk about the kingdom of God as sort of this very subversive seed that you plant, and then it sprouts out like a mustard seed that then becomes a tree that houses the birds, right? So I started sort of thinking about how like I've been oriented to church where the minister, like I was trained to be in front of people to speak a word and the people receive the word and they take it out and go out. And now what I was experiencing in art of hosting and in my circle work was that the word was being spoken by the people. And the people now were movements of the spirit. It's not just one directional now. Now it's multi-directional. And that's when I started shifting my idea and notions of church, which is like the movement of the spirit discerned by the community, and then the community having powerful conversations that move them into more liberation and to more a future that where everybody thrives, especially the least of these, right? So I mean, that's basically kind of how I've got into art of hosting was with this sort of movement building kind of mentality. And now in my life, I've actually been as a parent now too. I've kind of shifted out of movement spaces because I don't have the energy anymore. I'm
Right?
just gonna be honest.
That's real.
Now I'm in a place where I'm trying to integrate my a lot of what I've done in community spaces, but to integrate it back to the theme of this, which is like, how do we create safe enough places for us to heal as individuals, but also for us to heal as a community? So, whereas Circle and Art of Hosting was a place for these really robust conversations about social change, I've now, like, this Art of Hosting that you experienced in Chicago was one of the first in person trainings where we got to integrate a lot of the healing work that I just do on my own or I do it with a small group. But now we're integrating it into these conversation spaces, right? So, when I think of healing, I think of before I used to think it was really about like my own individual well being. And I still think it is, right? I am as a person, we are all carrying sort of generational trauma, right? So there's this like ecology, right, that we're in. It's like I'm rooted in a certain place, and what I am living out or adapting to in my environment has become are things that have come from my past, right? My childhood. So I'm trying to do that own inner work, right? And then there's this other piece where I feel like a lot of my work now is saying that the ways in which we create resilience, meaning like the flexible strength of us to move through when we feel activated, when we feel triggered, is yes, my own personal practices, but we can actually do that with and for each other. And that's really kind of where I'm moving into integrating healing is like, how do we have community spaces where we practice a little self-knowing, a little inner, like we do like I do grounding exercises, breathing exercises, ways for us to just ground ourselves. And then how do we buffer the impacts of that as a community in the connections and the relationships we make across?
That's beautiful, and it's really important. I was doing a teaching the other day, and I was talking about how for someone to be able to really move forward in their healing journey, they can't remain in a completely toxic environment that's continuing to poison them when they're seeking healing. And that's why the community component is so important. Now, for what you just described, can you just kind of speak to what you see as healing? Like, what does healing really look like?
When I describe it, I usually say healing is the movement towards wholeness. But I also think it's the wholeness for me is I am integrating, I think the word is integration, but it's there are parts of myself that have been wounded from various things in my own ecosystem or my history, right? And there are parts of myself that are really wounded. And that often shows up in my life in ways that I've adapted to those wounds as I've gotten older, right? So I've adapted in ways like I'm trying to think of things that induce shame for me and the responses I have towards them. Almost like sometimes it's an over response, right? Like something happens and all of a sudden, like my partner's like, okay, you're really angry about that, you know? So healing for me is when I start integrating both the self-knowledge of like, oh, I know why I'm triggered by that self-knowledge, and then the part of like, I'm now trusting myself to respond in ways that are more healthy. So it's like, I feel like healing is just this kind of like feedback loop of knowing myself, trusting myself in relationship with others, right? And then building practices and tools that help me cope and help me adapt in healthier ways.
Mhm, mhm. That self-awareness, the self-regulation, to be able to experience intimacy in these relationships are very important because you're right, when we do get reactivated by something that took us there, and we don't have the self-awareness, then we end up with a situation where a innocent bystander who just looks at you one way, you're ready to curse them out and don't even know why you're ready to curse them out. You know, these things happen.
And they're like, and the self-awareness is like building that like awareness of the patterns and the triggers, right? Like, ah, when these things happen, I'm pretty consistent in my reaction. So the thing about why when I do circle work particularly, I would say like in art of hosting, there are different what we call methodologies to what we say conversations is the heart of human processes for change is conversation. Human beings like as the way that we when we've grown and evolved, we've literally come back to this core practice of us talking and exchanging information, right? So but circle for me is the heart exchange space. It's not just where we exchange ideas. This is where we tell stories. This is where we um, connect to our like deeper heartfelt, I say, and like gut intuition truth. Um, and I'm trying to learn, and this is how I think my practice is evolving. Is not only practicing the skills for myself, but what is it to be in a settled body in a settled state. But it's how do we like learn and be aware and do that with one another. So for example, like I'm trying to like in terms of back to like what is a safe enough or a healing space in a group, I'm thinking about like how do we teach awareness of like when I have said something and it's impacted someone or other people in maybe a negative way, right? Then how do I in that space like practice a little, oh, I noticed I said something. Like, how did that land for you all? All right. Yeah, the practice of just checking in. And I'm noticing like healing is such a vulnerable practice too.
It
Like,
is. It is. Yes. You have to it's almost like when you say, for instance, you have an old wound from years ago, emotional wound. Let's compare it to a physical wound that you had that never was properly cared for, and now you have to remove the scab and then go back in and clean it up. You know, that's you're exposing. That's vulnerable.
you're like, how is this supposed to heal me when you're putting this on and it hurts to put it on, right? Or like as my kids say, it stings, right? Right, but like back to I mean, even to go with this analogy, right, of healing being like if I cut myself, right, and I give it what it needs to heal, and that yes, it stings and it's painful, right, and then let's say I put, and then it sort of scars a little bit, but if I keep in the same environment where it just keeps scratching the same area, right, it's like back to the I can't only just heal the wound. I have to also do the work and making those aware of me that that is still cutting me. And I think that's the vulnerability piece that I'm trying to learn in community is how to we work through in community spaces, workplaces, churches, family systems of like there's a wound here and whenever this happens, this dynamic happens, it's cutting me again. That I think that's the area of where I'm trying to grow in is to not only for us to do the work of knowing what hurts, but the vulnerable work of telling others that that hurts. And
Mhm.
then how do we actually start working together to start supporting each other in the either the boundaries or the words that we say, the tone that we say it, the how do we work together so that we don't keep, right, like either opening up that wound again or re-traumatizing or right causing more harm. And I think that's where I'm evolving into because I think about a lot of the work I've done in the past that when people have done really good work, it's usually when harm has been done that we fragment, meaning like we either leave church or we know we lose our friendship with them or we walk away, right? Like or movement spaces, they fragment, they factions happen, right? Like and I just think that there's another part of the work of healing that I think has to be done communally and it has to also be vulnerable enough to address like hurt and harm and then there's restorative practices, there's processes for it, but the part for me that I think is a deeper work is how to stay in it, how to stay in it, and build the resilience and the inner tolerance for that level of like healing that I think happens in community.
The inner tolerance. That's very interesting, those choice of words, and I do feel when you're talking about the vulnerability that's required for healing, especially when it comes to restorative practices, even around relationships that have been harmed, if even unintentionally, it's sometimes easier to walk away from a relationship and not do the work that's necessary to restore. Someone is in a situation like that where harm has been caused by a family member, a church, and they are dealing with their own trauma around that situation, and they are kind of thinking like, "Let me just leave." Like, do you have any thoughts around what could be considered to repair that relationship? If they should try to repair the relationship, what do you have to say in terms of that?
I always start with saying that if you are being abused or if you've tried to set boundaries and it has not been respected or you've been gaslit or it's unhealthy, that by all means, like you need to take care of yourself and to create enough safety for yourself. If that's physiological, psychological, emotional safety, to find it. Um, but I think the restorative process involves, multiple people agreeing that they want to move forward together and they want to change, improve, or transform a historical dynamic. Um, but in order to even get to that place, I'm noticing that, like, I'm doing work right now with school systems that there's just years and years of strained relationships that have caused mistrust. And I realize that the work, like, I can't even move yet into a restorative or communal healing process unless we do the individual work of when I say increasing my tolerance, it's almost to say, like, over the years, my trust has, my trust or my relationship with you has eroded so much that I have very little tolerance for anything. Oh, there you go again. There it is, right? So it's that so I use the word tolerance because it's almost like I'm asking you, I'm literally sometimes going into groups asking you, you may be here, but I'm going to ask to sit through this circle to just hear somebody with a different, you know, I'm going to ask you just to increase your tolerance just a little bit. And I don't know what that looks like for every single one of us. But the only way that we're going to move through this is if we're going to say, I'm going to create enough spaciousness in my heart and spaciousness in my body to just increase my tolerance a little bit before I shut it down or walk out, right? So it's just this like ask. I can't force it. I can't make anybody, right? But it's just like, I'm going to ask you to create a little space. And sometimes it's a grounding exercise. Sometimes I do a practice of like, what do you need to release to increase your ability to hear a little bit more today? Is there anything you need to release? Is it a belief? It's an old story? Is it an interaction that you had yesterday with these folks? Or what is it that you might need to release to create a little more spaciousness or a little bit more tolerance, so that we can hear each other a little bit more?
And releasing is hard. Sometimes we don't wanna release, sometimes we holding on to it. We're angry, we're hurt, they need to pay. These are things that we feel. Can you talk about releasing, the practice of releasing?
So there's different somatic practices, and to be honest, like I'm trying to learn this for myself. But some of the things that I feel like when I've done it, I'll start with the moments that I felt like when I've done it well and in a group, is oftentimes in a more ritual type way. Um, so I say ritual like, and it's not like some like new agey thing. It's just a ritual is just this like actions in a very sort of symbolic way that people attach meaning to. But it's usually embodied. Why I love rituals because it's not something that I can just think about, but I have to, do something. So what times that I've done things about releasing in a ritual way is we've done it with like water, where folks just pick up a pitcher of water and they say like something I'm holding on to, but I want to pour it out. I want to release it, but I want to pour it into a bowl that actually transforms into something that helps us be a little bit healthy, a bit more whole. So I've done like things that pour. I've done rituals where people burn things, they write things and they burn it. I've done rituals where there's a bowl in the middle and there's sand, and people write with a stick something in the sand, and a ritual cleansing by just brushing it over. And everybody goes, what do you need to release? Write it in the sand, and then we're just going to brush it over quietly and move back. And it's a very quiet exercise, but just a way of us doing something. And sometimes even with kids or with like we do shakes, we do like body like and it can be silly, or we can sometimes go like where is it sitting in your body, and we're just gonna put our hand there and we're gonna actually like breathe loving attention and kindness there until we release it. Where is it? Where are you holding that? How do we bring loving attention to it? So I think it's like my journey is in circle, and even in these conversational practices, is to keep returning to the body. Because in our trauma, right, it's like this is what I'm learning is like our not only does our body keep the score, but our body is the first to react, right? And even our thoughts come after, right? It's our body, and then it's our feeling, and then it's our thought. So I'm trying to come back to that and sort of help folks and help myself, right? Just pay attention to that, and how we can release it from our bodies.
That's a critical practice, understanding how our body plays such a role, how our body holds our trauma, and being able to release and identify how it goes back to the self-awareness. How is it affecting you? How did you respond in that moment? What caused that response? Okay, let me give myself love in this area.
Right, right.
That's beautiful. Anybody who is interested in learning more about art of hosting, where can they find out more information about that?
Okay, so I'm gonna point you to, well, one, artofhosting.org. But Art of Hosting is what's so powerful about it is like owned by no one, but owned by everyone. So it's a global group of practitioners. You can find where there are trainings around the world. But I'm going to just give a shout out to my community of elders that I practice with. We're a group called What's Next Now, and we are a collective that both like we utilize art of hosting and circle work to do a lot of social change. So that's kind of like the business work that I do with them. But then I also drop a link to the work that I'm leading a circle. It's called the Ancient Way of Circle, a practicum and retreat for leaders. I'll be leading that here in New York, in a very beautiful retreat space. So I teach circle at least once a year, and some of these things will come up there. But if you're interested, I can give you a link for that too.
Please share a link, anything that we can equip those who are listening or watching with so they can possibly incorporate that into their practice. I'm telling you now, I'm a believer. It was powerful. It's healing in community, there's healing in circle. And I value tremendously the work that you're doing, Chantilly.
It was a pleasure. I hope
Thank
you
you.
take care.
And thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Faith on the Journey. We are so grateful that you are here and hope you were encouraged by it. And remember that healing happens through community. And if you're looking to plug into community, check us out at faithonthejourney.org. We have a team of Christian counselors who are ready to serve you. And we also offer trauma healing trainings across the country. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to share with a friend, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, a 5-star review, so we can get this message out to the world. So that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much, family, for tuning in. And until next time, you stay encouraged and you keep your faith on the journey. I'll see you soon, family.